The Galactic Council had made their decision 30 years ago, and it remained unchanged since that day. Humanity was to stay isolated on Earth, and their solar system was marked with warning beacons that told all civilized species to maintain their distance. The decree had been unanimous, and no one dared to question it. Captain Vera Collins commanded the exploration vessel Horizon's Edge, and she had grown up hearing stories about the dangerous humans. Everyone knew about the Deathworlders who came from a planet so hostile that simply surviving there turned them into apex predators. She had watched the educational programs and seen footage from the First Contact War, and witnessed the terrifying efficiency of human soldiers in combat. Her navigation officer was a Kellian named Thresh, and he announced that they were maintaining proper distance from the Sol system with standard quarantine protocols in full effect. Vera nodded in acknowledgement because she understood the importance of these safety measures. The Kellians were a peaceful species that had evolved on a low-gravity moon with very few predators, and they had joined the Galactic Council 2 centuries earlier, bringing their gifts of mathematics and stellar navigation to the greater community. Vera asked about their distance from the relay station, and Thresh replied they were 4 light hours away and should arrive within 1 day cycle. The mission was completely routine, because they were simply inspecting and maintaining the communication relays that kept the vast galactic network functioning properly. This particular relay sat uncomfortably close to the human quarantine zone, but someone had to service it regardless of the location. Her second officer was a crystalline being named Rel from the Phosian species, and he reported unusual readings from the relay station. There were power fluctuations and intermittent signal losses that concerned him. Vera suggested it could be normal degradation, but her instincts told her something else was happening. Rel agreed it might be degradation, but the pattern seemed irregular and almost appeared as if something was actively interfering with the relay systems. 3 hours passed before they understood the true nature of the problem, and by then it was almost too late to escape. The Devourers had returned to this sector, and nobody had expected them to appear here. The species had no proper name that translator software could interpret, so everyone called them Devourers because that described exactly what they did. They consumed everything in their path, and entire worlds were stripped of all resources and left as barren rocks floating silently in the emptiness of space. The Galactic Council had fought them twice before, and both previous wars had been absolutely catastrophic in their cost. Billions had died in the fighting, and entire species had been driven to complete extinction by the relentless Devourer advance. Intelligence reports had placed the Devourers 3 spiral arms away, and supposedly they were still recovering from their last defeat 50 years ago. Thresh suddenly shouted that he was detecting multiple contacts, and his normally calm voice cracked with pure panic. He counted 15 vessels at first, but then corrected himself to 20 Devourer ships, and they were surrounding the relay station in a clear attack formation. Vera felt her blood run cold because the Devourers were not supposed to be anywhere near this sector, and their presence here meant something terrible was about to happen. She immediately ordered Thresh to send a priority alert to the Council with full encryption, and told him to inform them that the Devourers had returned and were dangerously close to heavily populated systems. While Thresh worked frantically at his console trying to establish the secure connection, Rel spoke up again with worse news. The Devourers had detected their small exploration ship, and 3 vessels were breaking formation and heading directly toward them. The Horizon's Edge was designed for exploration and scientific research and not for military combat. They had only basic defensive shields and minimal weapons that would be completely useless against 3 Devourer attack craft. Against such overwhelming force, they had absolutely no chance of survival through direct confrontation. Vera commanded evasive maneuvers and ordered maximum speed to try getting them away from the approaching enemy ships. The vessel lurched violently as the engines engaged at full power, but the Devourers were significantly faster than her exploration ship. The first energy blast struck their aft shields hard and caused the entire vessel to shudder from the impact. Alarm klaxons began wailing throughout the bridge, and emergency lights flashed everywhere. Rel reported that shields were down to 60% capacity, and warned that another hit of similar strength would cause them to lose shields entirely. Vera knew they had perhaps minutes before the Devourers destroyed them, and she made a decision that went against every protocol, and every law, and every warning she had ever been given during her entire career. She quietly ordered Thresh to set course directly for the Sol system and enter human space immediately. The bridge fell completely silent as every crew member turned to stare at their captain in absolute disbelief. Thresh began to protest and reminded her that humans were quarantined and entering their space was strictly forbidden and the penalties would be severe. Vera interrupted him and stated that penalties would mean absolutely nothing if they were all dead. She explained that if the Devourers were truly back and had already penetrated this deep into council space, then they desperately needed help from whatever source they could find. Another devastating blast rocked the ship violently, and shields dropped rapidly to 30% capacity. She ordered Thresh to execute her command immediately and take them to Earth, and privately prayed that the humans would not kill them before the Devourers could finish the job. The Horizon's Edge turned sharply toward the Forbidden Zone and raced past the warning beacons, while 3 Devourer ships maintained close pursuit. Behind them, at the relay station, 17 more Devourer vessels were spreading out and positioning themselves in what appeared to be preparation for a major invasion that would devastate countless innocent worlds. In the Sol system on a small blue planet that had been marked as too dangerous for any civilized contact, humanity was completely unaware that they were about to receive very unexpected visitors. The humans had spent 30 years in isolation, building their own future and developing their own technology, without any help from the species that had rejected them. They had created faster-than-light drives and powerful energy weapons and defensive grids that now surrounded every major installation throughout their solar system. Admiral Jack Patterson was reviewing routine fleet readiness reports at Earth Defense Command when the alert system suddenly started screaming warnings. Lieutenant Kate Morrison called out that they had multiple unknown vessels breaching the outer edge of the Oort cloud. She reported 1 small craft being actively pursued by 3 much larger vessels, and weapons fire had been detected. Jack was immediately on his feet because his 30 years of military experience snapped him into complete focus. Since the quarantine had been imposed 3 decades earlier, no alien vessel had dared to enter the Sol system. The Galactic Council had made their position abundantly clear that humanity was too violent and too dangerous and too unpredictable to ever join the galactic community. Humanity had accepted this isolation and decided they would build their own future without anyone's help. Jack ordered Morrison to get him a visual display immediately, and the main screen flickered to life, showing the tactical situation. 1 smaller vessel with failing shields was being systematically torn apart by 3 much larger attackers. Even as he watched, another devastating volley of energy weapons slammed hard into the fleeing ship's damaged hull. Morrison reported that the smaller ship was transmitting on all frequencies with both audio and visual components. It appeared to be a distress call asking for emergency assistance. Jack told her to play the transmission immediately so they could understand what was happening. The face that appeared on screen was distinctly non-human, with an elongated head and large dark eyes and pale blue skin. The alien was clearly terrified and desperate. The transmission began with the alien identifying herself as Captain Vera Collins of the Kellian exploration vessel Horizon's Edge. She stated they were under attack by Devourer forces, and their shields were failing rapidly. She formally requested emergency assistance under the Galactic Convention of Rescue, and begged whoever was receiving her message to please help them. The transmission suddenly cut off as another blast struck the ship hard, and Jack watched the shield indicators on his tactical display drop to critical levels. Morrison asked for orders and waited for his response. Jack did not hesitate for even 1 second, because whatever the political situation was with the Galactic Council, he absolutely refused to let anyone die on his watch. He ordered the launch of the Rapid Response Group immediately, and specified he wanted the Valiant and the Defiant and the Intrepid underway in 60 seconds. He told Morrison to inform Commander Hayes to engage those attacking vessels and protect the civilian craft at all costs. Within 45 seconds, 3 human warships were burning hard toward the battle at maximum acceleration. The 3 human warships were smaller than the Devourer vessels, but they had been built with humanity's characteristic approach to engineering that emphasized redundancy and durability. They had multiple backup systems and heavy armor plating and weapons that had been designed by a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the brutal art of warfare. These ships represented everything humanity had learned during their long isolation from the Galactic. Community Commander Lisa Hayes watched the tactical display from the bridge of the Valiant, and her crew was already at battle stations with all weapons charged and ready. The combat artificial intelligence systems were calculating targeting solutions and running probability scenarios for the upcoming engagement. She had reviewed the ID tactical data quickly and formulated a battle plan that would utilize human advantages in speed and firepower. She opened communications to all three ships and told them they would go in hard and fast against the attackers. She ordered them to target the enemy weapon systems and engine components, specifically because she wanted the Devourer ships disabled rather than completely destroyed. She explained they needed to capture at least one vessel intact so they could gather intelligence about this new threat. The three human warships dropped out of their high-speed approach vector and immediately opened fire with their primary weapons. Railgun rounds were accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, and they crossed the distance between the ships in just seconds. The first Devourer ship never detected the incoming projectiles until they were already striking home. The kinetic rounds punched straight through the Devourer's shields as if those defensive barriers were not even present. The solid projectiles tore deep into the vessel's propulsion system and caused massive internal damage. Secondary explosions began rippling along the hull in a cascading failure pattern, and the ship tumbled wildly out of control and became completely unable to continue fighting. The other two Devourer vessels reacted with impressive speed and turned to face this unexpected new threat. Their energy weapons were designed to overwhelm defensive shields through sustained concentrated fire, and they immediately lanced out toward the approaching human vessels with deadly intent. The bright beams of destructive energy crossed space and struck the Valiant's shields hard. The defensive shields absorbed the first full volley and flickered visibly, but they held firm against the attack. Hayes allowed herself a slight grim smile, because human shield technology had been specifically enhanced during the isolation years. She calmly ordered all batteries to return fire immediately and unleash everything they had against the enemy vessels. The space between the opposing ships suddenly lit up brilliantly with massive amounts of weapons fire from multiple sources. Railguns and missiles and laser batteries all fired simultaneously and created a devastating barrage. The second Devourer ship attempted to take evasive maneuvers, but human targeting computers had been refined through centuries of constant warfare, and they tracked every single movement with perfect accuracy. A spread of missiles detonated in a precise pattern around the evading Devourer ship, and the shaped charges were specifically designed to focus their explosive force inward toward the target. The concentrated blast overwhelmed the Devourer shields completely, and they collapsed in a spectacular cascade of energy. Follow-up railgun fire from multiple human ships struck the now unprotected hull and crippled the engine systems entirely. The third Devourer ship apparently decided that discretion was far more valuable than valor in this situation. The vessel turned sharply and attempted to flee at maximum speed from the engagement zone. It accelerated hard and began pulling away from the human ships, but it did not make it very far before being stopped. The Intrepid had been positioned perfectly in anticipation of exactly this kind of tactical scenario. The human ship launched a spread of specialized weapons that the crews called net missiles because of their unique function. The missiles deployed at extremely close range and released a complex mesh made of monomolecular cables that spread out rapidly. The impossibly thin but incredibly strong cables wrapped completely around the fleeing Devourer ship and fouled its engine systems. The cables tangled in the propulsion units and cut through external components and left the vessel dead in space and completely unable to move or fight. The entire engagement from first contact to final capture lasted exactly 93 seconds. Hayes ordered an immediate ceasefire and told her crew to dispatch recovery teams to secure the disabled Devourer ships. She wanted their computer systems accessed as quickly as possible to gather whatever intelligence they contained. She also told communications to hail the civilian vessel that had been under attack and inform them they were now completely safe. On the bridge of the Horizon's Edge, Captain Vera Collins stared at her view screen in a state of absolute shock and disbelief. She had witnessed the human ships emerge seemingly from nowhere and watched them tear apart 3 Devourer attack craft with terrifying casual efficiency. She had seen the kind of precisely coordinated military action that could only come from centuries of accumulated combat experience. Everything the Council had ever said about Humans being dangerous was completely and utterly true. They were absolutely terrifying in their effectiveness at violence and warfare. Thresh spoke quietly and informed Vera that they were being hailed by the humans and she needed to respond. Vera took a moment to steady herself because she had asked for their help and now she would have to face them directly. The face that appeared on her screen was female and human with short dark hair and eyes that seemed to carry the heavy weight of command responsibility. The human spoke, and the automatic translator rendered her words into the Kellyan language so Vera could understand perfectly. The human identified herself as Commander Lisa Hayes of the Earth Defense Force. Hayes stated calmly that the attacking vessels had been disabled and the civilian ship was now secure. She asked directly if the Horizon's Edge required any medical assistance or repairs for damage sustained during the attack. Vera found her voice and managed to respond despite her lingering shock at what she had just witnessed. She identified herself properly as Captain Vera. Collins and confirmed they did require repairs because their shields were completely offline, and they had sustained significant hull damage. But she emphasized that more importantly, they needed to speak with Earth's leadership immediately, because the situation was far more serious than anyone currently realized. Hayes's expression remained neutral and controlled, but Vera thought she detected a brief flicker of interest in those intense human eyes. Hayes acknowledged the request and stated she was transmitting coordinates for Earth orbit. She told Vera to follow the escort ships and promised they would get the Horizon's Edge properly repaired. Then they could discuss exactly what had scared the Galactic Council enough to send someone into the forbidden quarantine zone. As the human warships took up protective escort positions around her badly damaged vessel Vera, Collins came to a profound realization. Humanity's reputation for being dangerous was both completely well-earned and possibly represented. The galaxy's only real hope for survival against the Devourer threat. The small fleet turned and began moving toward Earth, and Vera felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear because she was about to enter the home system of the most dangerous species known to exist. Hope because perhaps that danger could be turned toward protecting the innocent, rather than threatening them. The journey to Earth took several hours, and during that time Vera had her crew begin compiling all the data they had about the Devourer invasion. Every scrap of intelligence and every tactical report, and every piece of information that might help the humans understand what they were facing. If she was going to ask humanity to risk themselves for a galaxy that had rejected them, then she owed them complete honesty. As Earth grew larger in the view screen, Vera saw a planet that looked deceptively beautiful and peaceful. Blue oceans and white clouds and green continents that seemed so tranquil from space. But she knew the truth that this peaceful appearance hid one of the most hostile environments in the known galaxy. A world of crushing gravity and corrosive atmosphere and violent weather, and yet, somehow humanity had not just survived but thrived. The human escort. Ships guided them into a high orbit, and Vera could see massive defensive platforms, and orbital stations and dozens of warships. Humanity had built an impressive military infrastructure during their 30 years of isolation. They had clearly not been idle during their forced separation. From the galactic community, a repair ship approached and docked with the Horizon's Edge and human engineers, began working immediately on fixing the damage. Vera was informed that a shuttle would arrive shortly to transport her to Earth Defense Command, where she would meet with Admiral Jack Patterson and other human leadership. She prepared herself mentally for what would likely be the most important conversation of her entire life. She was about to ask the most dangerous species in the galaxy to save everyone who had called them too violent to join civilization. The irony was not lost on her. Thresh approached and asked quietly if she really thought the humans would help them. Vera looked at her loyal navigation officer and gave him the only honest answer she had. The conference room in Earth Defense Command was designed purely for functionality, rather than comfort or aesthetic appeal. Admiral Jack Patterson sat at the head of a long table with military and civilian leadership arranged along both sides. Scientists and diplomats and generals had all gathered to hear what Captain Vera Collins had traveled so far to tell them about. The Kellyan captain stood at the presentation podium, and her tall, slender frame seemed almost fragile when compared to the muscular builds of the humans in the room. But her voice remained steady and confident as she began speaking and telling them things they had never heard before about how the galaxy truly viewed them. She stated bluntly that 30 Years ago, when humanity made first contact with the Galactic Council, every species had been terrified. She explained it was not because of human technology, which had been admittedly quite primitive at that time. The fear came from what humanity represented as a species, and what their very existence meant for the established galactic order. Secretary of State Ellen Pierce leaned forward with obvious interest and asked directly what humanity represented that caused such widespread fear. Vera replied that humans represented survival against impossible odds in the harshest environment imaginable. She explained that Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, which was the absolute highest rating on the official habitability scale. She continued, explaining that Earth's gravity was absolutely crushing by the standards of most galactic species. The atmosphere was highly corrosive and filled with reactive oxygen that would be poisonous to most forms of life in the galaxy. The weather patterns were catastrophically violent and unpredictable. The tectonic activity was extreme and dangerous. The planet had been struck by extinction-level events multiple times throughout its history, and yet life had not only survived but actually thrived and diversified. She pulled up holographic displays showing Earth alongside various other inhabited planets from across the galaxy. For comparison, she explained that her homeworld Perilous was rated as only Class 3, with gentle gravity and stable climate and peaceful ecology. Most Council worlds fell somewhere between Class 2 and Class 5 on the scale. Only a small handful of worlds anywhere exceeded Class 7 rating. General Paul Martinez spoke up and said he was failing to see the actual problem with this situation. He pointed out that humans came from a tough neighborhood, but asked why that justified imposing a quarantine. Vera explained that humans had evolved specifically to match their incredibly hostile environment in every possible way. She told them that human bodies were incredibly dense and strong compared to most species. Human immune systems were absolutely ferocious and designed to fight off thousands of different pathogens simultaneously. Human reflexes were lightning fast because anything slower had been killed by Earth's numerous predators. Humans required barely any sleep compared to other species. Humans could survive injuries that would kill most other galactic species outright. She paused and looked around at the assembled humans before continuing with the psychological aspects. She explained that mentally and psychologically, humans were relentless in ways other species simply could not match. Humans did not give up when facing obstacles. They adapted to new situations. They overcame seemingly impossible challenges. They persisted against any opposition, no matter how overwhelming it appeared. She described what Council observers had witnessed during the First Contact War before the ceasefire was established. They had watched human soldiers continue fighting effectively even with wounds that should have completely incapacitated them. They saw human ships survive catastrophic damage that would have destroyed vessels from any other species. They observed human tactics, and the ability to improvise solutions and the willingness to sacrifice for their unit members. Jack stated flatly that the Council had simply locked humanity away and decided they were too dangerous to interact with civilized society. Vera admitted that yes, the vote had been completely unanimous. Even the warrior species who had extensive combat experience voted for the quarantine. She explained that humans were not just warriors but rather survivors who had learned to make war, and that combination terrified everyone. Dr. Sarah Kim, who served as chief science advisor, adjusted her glasses and said she appreciated the history lesson. However, she pointed out that Vera had not breached the quarantine just to tell them they were scary. She asked what was really happening in Council space that had driven Vera to take such desperate action. Vera's expression became grim and serious as she changed the holographic display to show star maps with red markers spreading across multiple sectors. She explained that 3 months ago, Devourer fleets had begun appearing throughout Council space in unprecedented numbers. These were not small raiding parties, but rather full invasion forces with massive firepower. They had already completely consumed 6 worlds. 12 more worlds were currently under active siege. Unlike previous encounters, the Devourers now had allies which were species nobody had ever seen before, coming from dark space beyond the galactic rim. Jack asked how bad the situation had become, and Vera's voice cracked slightly as she answered. She told them the Council had mobilized every single defense fleet they possessed. It was not nearly enough to stop the invasion. The Devourers had somehow adapted to Council tactics and weapons. The Council forces were losing badly on every front. She revealed that her homeworld Perilous was directly in the path of the Devourer advance. Evacuation operations had begun 2 weeks earlier, but there were billions of civilians who would not make it out in time before the Devourers arrived. Her voice trembled as she spoke, about her family and friends who were still on the planet waiting for rescue that might never come. The room fell into heavy silence as everyone absorbed the implications of what Vera had just told them. Ellen Pierce spoke slowly and carefully to make sure she understood correctly. She stated that the Galactic Council had quarantined humanity because they were too dangerous, but now that the Council faced complete extinction, they wanted human help. Vera surprised everyone by saying no and explaining that the Council did not know she was here. They would never authorize any contact with humanity, because their arrogance would not allow them to admit they needed help from the species they feared most. She had come to Earth on her own initiative without any orders and was breaking every law that existed. If she returned to Council space, she would be immediately arrested and imprisoned for violating the quarantine. Jack asked why she would come at all if the Council did not want human involvement. Vera looked directly at him and explained she had spent years studying human history in secret. She had read human literature and watched human films and analyzed human military doctrines extensively. She had realized something that the rest of the Council refused to acknowledge or accept. She advanced the hologram to show images of humans in various scenarios throughout their history. There were soldiers rescuing civilians from disaster zones, firefighters running into burning buildings to save strangers, ordinary people risking their lives for others without any expectation of reward. She told them that yes, humans were dangerous and capable of terrible violence, but humans were also capable of something equally powerful and important. Humans were capable of heroism. They could sacrifice themselves for others. They fought to protect those who could not protect themselves. It was not just basic survival instinct, but something deeper that the Council did not understand because most species had never truly struggled for existence. She turned back to face the room and spoke with conviction. She explained she came to Earth because she believed humanity would not simply watch billions of innocent people die, even if those people had rejected them. She came because when she looked at what humanity could become, she saw the galaxy's only real hope. She came to ask humans to save everyone even though nobody deserved their help. The silence stretched out for long moments as everyone processed her words. Finally, Jack stood up and told Vera he needed her to provide everything she had. He wanted complete star charts and tactical data on the Devourers and communication protocols for the Council fleet. Then he said she needed to get some rest because she looked like she had not slept in days. Vera started to protest, but Jack interrupted and made it clear that was not a request, but an order. He told her they would reconvene in 6 hours and that he had important calls to make. As security personnel escorted Vera out of the conference room, Ellen Pierce moved to stand beside Jack. She stated quietly that he was actually considering helping the Council, despite everything they had done. Jack looked at the star map still displayed showing the spread of the Devourer invasion. He said the president would make the final decision, but yes, he was going to recommend they help. Ellen asked what his reasoning was, and Jack explained simply. 30 years ago, the Council had judged humanity without really knowing them. Now humanity had a chance to show everyone who they really were. Ellen asked who humans were, and Jack replied, they were the species that ran toward danger instead of away from it. They were the species that did not abandon people in need, even if those people had wronged them. That was what made them human. Ellen smiled slightly and commented that the Council was going to completely lose their minds. 3 days after the meeting with Vera Collins, the first human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kelios system. They arrived to find a desperate battle already in progress, and the situation looked far worse than anyone had anticipated based on the intelligence reports. The Galactic Council's defense fleet was making what appeared to be a final desperate stand against overwhelming odds. 73 ships of various designs remained from what had originally been a force of over 200 vessels. They fought bravely against impossible numbers as the Devourer fleet, which numbered in the hundreds, slowly ground through their shields and armor with relentless efficiency. Commander Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the Valiant, which now served as the flagship of humanity's expeditionary force. Behind her formation, 50 human warships held perfect positions with their crews at battle stations ready for immediate action. Every ship bristled with weapons and every crew member understood the stakes of what they were about to. The tactical officer reported that the Council fleet was taking extremely heavy casualties across all ship classes. He estimated they had less than 1 hour remaining before complete collapse of their defensive formation. The Devourers were systematically pressing their numerical advantage and focusing concentrated fire on the larger council vessels to break the defensive line. Hayes asked about the planet below and received confirmation that evacuation operations were still ongoing. Millions of civilians remained on the surface waiting for transport. If the orbital defense collapsed completely, the Devourers would begin surface bombardment and kill everyone who had not escaped. Hayes studied the tactical display carefully and analyzed the Devourer positioning. They had arranged themselves exceptionally well and created overlapping fields of fire that made any direct approach extremely deadly. The Council ships were being forced into an increasingly tight defensive formation that only accelerated their inevitable destruction. Ordered communications to open a channel to the Council. Flagship on all available frequencies. When the channel was confirmed open, she took a deep breath before speaking. She identified herself as Commander Lisa Hayes of the Earth Defense Force and informed them that 50 human warships were ready to engage immediately. She transmitted tactical data and formation coordinates directly to their systems. She stated clearly that humans were here to help, whether the Council wanted their assistance or not. She did not wait for any response from the shocked Council officers. She immediately ordered all ships to execute attack pattern Delta 7 and told them to target the Devourer command vessels first. She said it was time to show the galaxy what Deathworlders could really do in combat. The human fleet split smoothly into 5 groups of 10 ships each and began accelerating rapidly to combat speed. The Devourers detected the new contacts and began redirecting ships to intercept this unexpected threat. What happened in the next few minutes would be analyzed and studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. The human ships did not slow down or hesitate for even a moment. Instead, they accelerated even faster and burned toward the Devourer lines at speeds the enemy had not anticipated from vessels of that size. At the last possible moment before collision, the human ships broke formation and scattered like water droplets hitting stone. Each group exploited gaps in the enemy coverage with perfect precision. The Devourers opened fire immediately, and their energy weapons tracked the human vessels across space. But the humans had carefully studied Vera's tactical data and prepared specifically for this. Their shields were modulated to effectively disperse energy weapons, and their armor incorporated ablative materials that absorbed tremendous heat. They absorbed hits that should have crippled them and simply kept coming forward. Then the humans returned fire with devastating effect. Railgun slugs accelerated to significant fractions of light speed, began punching through Devourer shields with ease. The sheer kinetic energy of solid projectiles traveling at such velocity completely overwhelmed defensive systems that had been designed primarily to dissipate energy weapons. Missiles followed immediately behind, carrying shaped charges that detonated at precisely calculated moments to maximize damage. The first Devourer dreadnought died in a massive cascade of explosions as its power core was breached by a railgun round that penetrated straight through multiple decks. The second dreadnought survived the initial human assault but found itself immediately surrounded by 4 human ships that poured concentrated fire into its wounded flank until the massive vessel broke apart completely. On the bridge of the Council flagship Supreme, Commander Thrace watched events unfold in absolute stunned disbelief. The crystalline Phosian had commanded fleets for 40 years and had fought in the previous Devourer War. He had never witnessed anything remotely like the display of coordinated violence he was seeing from the human fleet. His tactical officer whispered that these were humans and reminded him they were the quarantined species that everyone feared. Thrace immediately ordered communications to establish a channel with the human commander. When Hayes's face appeared on his view screen, he began speaking about violation of quarantine protocols and unauthorized entry into Council space. Hayes interrupted him bluntly and said they could discuss paperwork later. Right now, she needed him to reform his battered fleet immediately. She told him to pull damaged ships back to the planet's orbital stations for emergency repairs. She wanted his remaining heavy cruisers to join the human formation. They were going to push straight through the center of the Devourer line and shatter their command structure. Thrace protested that breaking through so many enemy ships was completely impossible. Hayes smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. She told the Supreme Commander that humans were Death Worlders and breaking things was what they did best. She asked directly if he was with them or not. Thrace looked at his tactical display and watched human ships tearing through the Devourer formation like predators through prey. He thought about his orders and the quarantine and all the laws he had sworn to uphold. Then he thought about the millions of Kellian, civilians still trapped on the planet below waiting desperately for rescue. He gave the order for all council ships to follow the human fleet's lead and reform on their coordinates. He told his captains to prepare for full assault alongside their unexpected allies. The combined fleet consisting of council ships and human ships working together for the first time in history drove hard into the heart of the Devourer formation. The battle became a brutal grinding engagement with ships on both sides taking terrible damage. But the humans demonstrated one critical advantage the Devourers had not anticipated. They absolutely refused to stop fighting regardless of damage sustained. A human destroyer with shields completely down and hull breached in multiple locations deliberately rammed a Devourer cruiser rather than retreat to safety. The massive explosion destroyed both ships but also created a crucial gap in the enemy defensive line. Human frigates, which were fast and highly maneuverable, immediately exploited the opening and struck hard at vulnerable support ships. Positioned behind the Devourer front line, a transmission came through on the fleet channel from Lieutenant Alan Cooper commanding the Intrepid. He reported they had lost main engines and their reactor was reaching critical levels. Abandoned ship orders had been given and the crew was evacuating in escape pods, but he noted they were drifting on a ballistic course directly toward a Devourer command ship, and their missiles were still armed and functional. He stated they might as well make their sacrifice count for something meaningful. Hayes watched as the Intrepid continued its final trajectory with the crew already safely away in pods. At the last possible moment, the ship's remaining missiles launched in one final salvo and detonated against the Devourer command vessel shields. The shields collapsed from the concentrated impact and then the Intrepid struck home. The resulting explosion was visible across the entire battlefield. Hayes whispered quietly that the sacrifice was for Earth and for every innocent person they were fighting to protect. The loss of the Devourer command ship threw their entire fleet into immediate confusion. Their carefully coordinated formation began collapsing as individual ships lost communication with Central Command. Ships started breaking off to retreat rather than continue fighting. The human and council forces pressed their advantage hard, and what had been a disciplined enemy fleet became scattered groups of ships fleeing desperately into dark space. 6 hours after the first human ships arrived at Kelios, the battle was finally over. The Devourers had been completely routed and their invasion fleet was shattered beyond any hope of recovery. Hayes stood quietly on her bridge looking at casualty reports that showed the cost of victory. 7 human ships had been lost completely. 11 more were severely damaged and might never fight again. Hundreds of crew members were dead and thousands more were wounded and waiting for medical treatment. Her tactical officer said quietly that they had won the battle. Hayes corrected him and said they had survived and proved an important point. The room fell silent as everyone processed what they had accomplished and what it had cost them. On the surface of Kelios in refugee camps and emergency shelters AC. 2 months after the Battle of Kelios, representatives from 53 council species gathered in the Grand Assembly Hall for the most attended session in 2 centuries. Everyone wanted to witness what would happen when humanity finally addressed the Galactic Council. After 3 decades of forced isolation, Admiral Jack Patterson walked into the massive chamber with a small delegation of 6 humans. There was no military escort and no weapons, and they wore only formal diplomatic attire. Ellen Pierce walked beside him along with Dr. Sarah Kim and 3 other carefully chosen advisors who represented different aspects of human society. The assembly hall fell into complete silence as the humans took their designated position at the central podium. This space was traditionally reserved for accused parties or those making formal petitions to the council. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present in the chamber. Supreme Commander Thrace, who had been given the honor of presenting humanity's case after his passionate defense of their actions, stood at the council's official speaking platform. His crystalline form refracted the chamber's bright lights into rainbow patterns. Across the walls and ceiling, he began by addressing the honored delegates and explained they had gathered to discuss the status of humanity and the quarantine that had isolated them for 30 years. He stated that recent events had forced everyone to seriously reconsider their previous judgments about human nature. A murmur ran through the assembled delegates as many species looked at the humans with mixtures of curiosity and barely concealed fear. Some had heard stories about the battles, but few had actually seen humans in person before this moment. Thrace continued and explained that the Devourer invasion had threatened 17 worlds across Council space. Their best projections had indicated complete planetary collapse would occur within weeks. Billions of innocent civilians would have died horrible deaths. Council fleets had been completely insufficient for the task. Their weapons had proven inadequate against the enemy. They had been losing badly on every front. He paused deliberately to let the full weight of those words settle over the chamber. Then he explained that humanity had arrived uninvited and unauthorized in direct violation of all quarantine protocols. They engaged a vastly superior Devourer force at Kelios and suffered significant casualties but emerged victorious against impossible odds. He detailed how human fleets had participated in 14 major engagements across Council space since that first battle. They had successfully liberated 4 occupied worlds and saved countless lives. They had evacuated 32 million refugees from war zones. They had trained Council military personnel in new tactics that proved devastatingly effective against Devourer forces. Thrace turned to look directly at the human delegation standing patiently at the podium. He stated clearly that humans had done all of this knowing the Council had rejected them decades earlier. Knowing they had been called dangerous and primitive and unworthy of joining galactic civilization, they came anyway because helping others was simply the right thing to do. Council member Vorin, who was a proud Dravian with bronze-colored scales that glinted in the light, rose from his seat. He stated with respect to the Supreme Commander that none of this changed what humans fundamentally were. They remained violent and aggressive and unpredictable by nature. Yes, they had helped during the crisis, and everyone was grateful, but gratitude did not erase the inherent threat they posed to peaceful species. Jack raised his hand politely and requested permission to speak. The gesture surprised many delegates because humans were actually asking for permission rather than simply taking what they wanted through force. Jack stated calmly that Council member Vorin raised a completely fair point. Humans were indeed capable of tremendous violence. They had evolved on a world that absolutely demanded they become apex predators or face extinction. Human history was filled with conflict and warfare and suffering. He said they did not deny any of that difficult truth. He looked around the chamber carefully and made direct eye contact with delegates from dozens of different species. He explained that human history was also filled with cooperation and compassion and courage. Yes, humans fought, but they also built wonderful things. They created beautiful art and moving music and profound literature. They explored not to conquer territory, but to understand the universe. They had developed concepts like human rights and the belief that every sapient being possessed inherent dignity and worth. He admitted humans were not perfect by any measure, but stated they were trying constantly to become better with each passing generation. Ellen Pierce stepped forward and added that the quarantine had been based primarily on fear. Fear of what humans might do and what they might become. But fear was a poor foundation for any relationship, whether between individuals or between entire species. She pointed out that the Council had been afraid humans would become conquerors and warmongers and threats to galactic peace. Instead, humans had proven to be loyal allies and dedicated defenders and genuine friends. She asked if humanity did not deserve to be judged based on their actual actions rather than fearful assumptions. Dr. Sarah Kim contributed from a scientific perspective and explained that humanity brought unique capabilities to the galactic community. Human medical knowledge developed to combat Earth's hostile biosphere had already helped treat 3 previously incurable Council diseases. Human engineering, born from the need to survive impossible conditions, had improved shield technology by 30%. Human psychological resilience, which others found so frightening, made them ideal for roles other species simply could not fill. She emphasized they were not asking for special treatment or privileges. They were simply asking for a fair chance to contribute their abilities to the greater galactic good. Council member Lissa, who was an elderly Kellian whose homeworld humanity had saved, rose slowly from her seat. Her age and high status commanded immediate respectful attention from everyone present. She stated that she had been among those who voted for the quarantine 30 years earlier. She admitted she had been deeply afraid of humans and their strength and aggression and potential for destruction. She had genuinely believed the quarantine would make the galaxy safer for everyone. She paused and her large dark eyes shimmered with emotion. She said simply that she had been completely wrong. Her grandchildren were alive today only because humans had fought for them. They fought for strangers and for people who had rejected them, and for no reward except knowing they were doing what was right. She described watching human medics work triple shifts in refugee camps without complaint. She had seen human engineers risk their lives repairing damaged orbital stations. She had witnessed their tears when they could not save everyone despite their best efforts. Her voice grew stronger as she continued speaking. She declared that humans were not the monsters everyone had imagined. They were people just as flawed and as wonderful as any species in the chamber. They deserved to take their rightful place among the galactic community, not as dangerous outsiders but as valued members. She formally moved to end the quarantine immediately and extend full council membership to humanity. The chamber erupted in heated debate, with delegates arguing passionately from multiple perspectives. Some supported the motion immediately without reservation. Others raised concerns and questioned protocols and demanded more time to study all implications. The discussion continued for hours as every species wanted their position heard and recorded. Finally, after exhaustive debate, the vote was called and the chamber fell silent. Jack stood with his delegation, trying hard not to show how nervous he felt. 30 years of isolation could end today, or humanity could face rejection. Again, despite everything they had sacrificed. The results appeared on the main display, showing 157 votes in favor of ending the quarantine and 43 against, with 12 abstentions. The chamber fell completely silent for a long moment. Then Lissa began a slow, rhythmic tapping, which was the Kellian gesture of approval and celebration. Thrace joined in, and his crystalline body produced beautiful chiming sounds. One by one, delegates across the chamber added their own species' expressions of joy until the entire hall resonated with a symphony of different sounds, all expressing the same sentiment of welcome. Jack felt Ellen grip his hand tightly as emotion overwhelmed her. Dr. Kim was crying openly with happiness. The other human delegates stood in stunned silence, completely overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed and achieved. Council Chairperson Eldrin announced formally that humanity was hereby granted full membership in the Galactic Council with all rights and privileges and responsibilities. He declared that the galaxy had become richer for having Death Worlders among them, and this day would be remembered throughout history. Later, at the reception following the historic vote, Jack found himself talking quietly with Vera Collins. The Kellian captain had been completely vindicated by recent events, and all charges against her had been quietly dismissed. Jack told her she had taken one hell of a risk coming to Earth. Vera replied that he had taken an equal risk, coming to save people who had wronged humanity. Jack acknowledged they had lost good people in the fighting, but said they died knowing they made a real difference. That was all any warrior could ask for, Vera